The convent stood quietly on the edge of a small town, surrounded by tall trees and old stone walls that had seen decades go by. Inside, everything moved at a slow, peaceful rhythm. The sound of footsteps on the tiled floor, the rustle of robes, and the distant ringing of church bells filled the air. Life there was calm, simple, and filled with daily routines of prayer, chores, and kindness. Among the sisters who lived there was an elderly nun who had been part of the convent for more than 40 years. Her days began before sunrise. She would wake up, light a candle near the small wooden cross by her bed, and whisper a prayer. After that, she would go to the kitchen and help prepare breakfast for everyone. She didn't speak much, but her quiet smile and gentle way of doing things made people feel peaceful around her. To the younger nuns, she was just the kind old sister who watered the garden and fed the birds near the window. They admired her patience but never really knew much about her past. She rarely talked about her younger days. To them, she had always been old and kind, someone who seemed like she was born to live in that quiet convent. One afternoon, the convent received a new piano. It was a gift from a local donor who wanted to support their upcoming charity event. The shiny black instrument was placed near the chapel's corner, and everyone gathered around to look at it. The younger sisters clapped their hands with excitement. The piano looked beautiful, though none of them were skilled enough to play more than a few basic tunes. When the elderly nun saw the piano, something deep inside her stirred. Her eyes lingered on it longer than anyone else's. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. The way her fingers twitched slightly at her side, the way she tilted her head as if she could already hear the sound it could make. All of it hinted that this piano meant more to her than the others realized. Later that evening, when most of the sisters had gone to their rooms, she stayed back in the chapel, standing quietly beside the piano. Her reflection shone faintly in the glossy surface. Slowly, she reached out and touched the edge of the keys, almost afraid. The memory of sound flooded her mind. Not just sound, but years of music that once filled her life. She could almost feel the energy of her youth again. The rhythm of her fingers dancing on the keys, the sound that once filled concert halls and hearts alike. But she withdrew her hand quickly, as if caught doing something she shouldn't. She wasn't that woman anymore, she thought. That part of her life was gone, or so she tried to believe. She whispered a prayer, closed the piano lid gently, and walked away. The next morning, during breakfast, one of the young sisters mentioned the piano again. "Wouldn't it be wonderful if someone could play for the charity night?" she said cheerfully. The others agreed, but no one had the skill. They thought about inviting someone from the town, maybe a teacher or a student from the music school. The elderly nun quietly sipped her tea and listened. Then softly she said, "Perhaps I could try." The table went silent for a moment. The younger sisters looked at each other awkwardly. They didn't want to sound rude, but they couldn't imagine her playing a whole concert. One of them smiled kindly and said, "Oh, sister, that's so sweet of you to offer. But maybe it's better if we find someone who practices regularly. It's a big event and we want everything to go smoothly." The old nun nodded slowly, still smiling. But her eyes dimmed a little. "Of course," she said gently. "You're right." The conversation moved on, but her heart stayed quiet. That night, when everyone was asleep, she walked back to the chapel again. The candles were out, and the moonlight slipped through the stained glass, painting soft colors on the floor. She sat on the piano bench, hesitating. For a few moments, she just sat there in silence. Then she lifted the lid and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers felt stiff at first, her joints weak and unsteady. She pressed a single note. It echoed softly through the empty hall, long and pure. Then another, and another. Slowly, like a bird remembering how to fly, her hands began to move with grace she hadn't felt in years. The tune that came out was gentle and emotional. Not perfect, not strong, but full of feeling. Every note carried a memory, every pause carried a lifetime. The sound filled the chapel as if the old stone walls themselves were listening. When she finished, tears had filled her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she missed this. The music, the emotion, the sense of being alive through something larger than herself. For years, she had buried this part of her, believing it was gone forever. But in that quiet moment, it came back as if it had been waiting for her all along. The next morning, one of the younger nuns entered the chapel early to arrange flowers and froze when she saw the piano lid still open. She noticed faint marks on the keys, the kind left by gentle but experienced fingers. She wondered who had played but didn't ask. As the days passed, the charity event grew closer. Posters were made, invitations were sent, and excitement filled the convent. The elderly nun continued her quiet duties, helping with decorations and guiding the younger ones in prayer. She never mentioned the piano again, though sometimes her eyes would drift toward it when she thought no one was looking. One afternoon, the head of the convent came to check the arrangements. She was a kind but serious woman who believed in keeping order and structure. When she saw the elderly nun near the piano, she said softly, "It's a beautiful instrument, isn't it?" The old nun smiled and nodded. "It is," she said, her voice calm. "Would you like to play during the event?" The head asked politely, though her tone suggested she didn't expect a yes. The elderly nun thought for a moment and then said quietly, "If you'll allow it." The head hesitated. "Perhaps just a short hymn," she said. "Something simple. The audience will enjoy that." The nun agreed, though deep down she knew the music inside her was anything but simple. That evening she practiced again, softly, making sure no one heard. The melodies came back faster now, smoother. Her fingers moved with surprising strength, finding beauty in every chord. It was as if the years had melted away when she touched those keys, but she was careful. She didn't want anyone to think she was showing off. She just wanted to feel alive again, even if only for a few minutes on that stage. On the day of the charity event, the convent buzzed with energy. Guests arrived in their best clothes. Townspeople filled the small hall and candles flickered all around. The atmosphere was joyful. The younger sisters hurried back and forth, serving food, arranging seats, and greeting visitors. When the time came for the piano performance, the elderly nun stood near the corner, quietly waiting. She was supposed to play a small hymn at the end, nothing more. But just as the event began, the sister who was meant to perform the opening piece came running up in distress. She had lost her voice and couldn't sing. The head of the convent looked worried. "What shall we do?" she whispered. "We can't begin in silence." Before anyone could answer, the elderly nun stepped forward. Her voice was steady but soft. "I can play something," she said, "just to begin the evening." The head looked at her uncertainly. The crowd was large, the mayor was present, and there were cameras for the local news. This was an important event, but with no other choice, she nodded. "All right, sister," she said gently. "Just something short." The elderly nun walked slowly to the piano. The hall grew quiet. Some people whispered to each other, curious. She looked fragile, almost too old to move her fingers across the keys. But when she sat down, her back straightened and her hands hovered over the keyboard like they had found their purpose again. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, trembling slightly. But then, like a wave gaining strength, the sound grew deeper, richer, more alive. The melody filled the room, wrapping around every person there. People stopped talking, their eyes fixed on her. The younger nuns stared in disbelief. They had never seen her like this. Her hands moved with grace, her face calm but glowing. Every note carried emotion, joy, sadness, faith, and love, all mixed into one powerful song. It wasn't just music. It was her soul speaking after years of silence. When the final note faded, the room stayed still. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the applause came, soft at first, then louder, rising like thunder. Tears rolled down the faces of those who listened. The elderly nun simply smiled, bowed her head slightly, and walked back to her seat, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but everyone knew something had, and that was only the beginning of what would soon become a story the whole world would come to. No. The night after the charity event, the convent felt different. The air carried a quiet excitement, and everyone still spoke softly about what they had witnessed. The guests who had attended couldn't stop talking about the elderly nun's performance. Some said it was the most touching music they had ever heard. Others said it felt like time had stopped while she played. The younger sisters replayed the memory in their minds again and again. Many of them had never seen a piano played like that, especially not by someone they thought too fragile to even lift the cover of the instrument. It was humbling and magical all at once, but the elderly nun herself didn't speak much about it. After the applause, she had gone back to her room quietly, as if she had done nothing unusual. The next morning she was back in the garden, watering the roses like always, humming softly under her breath. To her, it was just a moment of music, a small offering from her heart, not something to make a fuss about. Still, the story didn't stay inside the convent walls. One of the visitors that evening had recorded her performance on their phone. The video was short, just a few minutes, but it captured the emotion of her playing perfectly. Within hours, it began to spread online. People shared it on social media, writing captions like, "You have to hear this," and "This performance will touch your heart." By the next day, the video had thousands of views. Within a week, it had millions. The convent had no idea how quickly it was spreading. They didn't even know it had been filmed. Then letters started arriving. Emails, phone calls, even people showing up at the church asking to meet the woman in the video. Reporters called, musicians wanted to interview her, and people from around the world began sending messages of love and admiration. The younger sisters were amazed. They had never seen such attention. They gathered around the small office computer, reading message after message. "She reminded me of my grandmother. Her music made me cry. I had given up playing piano until I watched this. It was overwhelming, but beautiful." When they told the elderly nun what had happened, she seemed surprised but not excited. She simply smiled and said softly, "If the music touched hearts, then that is enough. I played for love, not fame." The sisters nodded, but deep down they were in awe of her calmness. The world was talking about her, and she continued living like nothing had changed. A few days later, the convent received a call from a television network. They wanted to film a short documentary about her life. The head of the convent hesitated. They valued peace and privacy. But the nun herself said gently, "If it can bring kindness into the world, then let them come." When the crew arrived, they were expecting someone different, maybe a dramatic, talkative woman who enjoyed the spotlight. Instead, they found a quiet figure in simple robes sitting by the window feeding birds. She welcomed them with a kind smile and offered them tea. Her humility caught everyone off guard. They asked her questions about her performance, her past, and how she learned to play. She didn't boast or tell long stories. She spoke with simplicity. She told them she had learned piano as a young girl, that she had once dreamed of performing across the world, but life had taken her in another direction. When they asked why she had stopped playing for so many years, she looked down at her hands and said softly, "Because I thought my time for music was over. I thought silence was my gift now." The interviewer asked what made her decide to play that night. Her eyes softened as she answered, "Sometimes God puts a melody inside you that refuses to fade. I just followed it." When the documentary aired, people all over the country watched it. The response was overwhelming. News channels replayed her story, newspapers wrote about her, and music teachers shared her words with their students. People were calling her the miracle pianist nun and the woman who played from the soul. The convent, once quiet and almost forgotten, now had visitors from across the world. Some came to pray, some to hear her play, and others simply to thank her. Children brought her flowers, families came with letters, and musicians traveled long distances to meet her. But she never treated herself like a celebrity. To her, she was still the same, a woman who loved peace, prayer, and simple kindness. She accepted all the attention gracefully, but always reminded people, "Don't praise me. Praise the gift." However, not everyone understood her peace. Some people tried to convince her to perform on bigger stages. A well-known music producer visited her one afternoon, bringing gifts and promises. He told her she could record an album, perform in grand theaters, and raise money for good causes. He spoke excitedly about how millions would come to see her and how her story could inspire the world even more. He truly believed he was helping. But when he finished, she smiled kindly and said, "Music is not about being seen. It is about being felt." He didn't know how to respond. There was something unshakable in her simplicity, something the world couldn't quite understand anymore. The sisters admired her more than ever. They saw how fame could have changed her, but it didn't. She still woke up early, still prayed the same, still watered the same flowers. The only difference was that now, sometimes, children from the nearby village would visit her in the afternoons, and she would teach them small tunes on the piano. She didn't teach them for money or recognition. She just wanted them to feel what she had always felt, that music wasn't about perfection or applause. It was about emotion, honesty, and connection. One day, a young boy came to the convent with his mother. He was shy and quiet, carrying a small notebook where he had drawn pictures of pianos. The mother told the elderly nun that her son loved music but couldn't afford lessons. The nun knelt down to the boy's level and said softly, "Then you can learn here, little one. The piano does not ask for money, it asks for love." From that day on, she began teaching a few children every week. The laughter and the sound of their small hands on the keys filled the once silent chapel. The sisters often stood by the doorway smiling as they watched the children learn. But as weeks passed, her health began to weaken slightly. She tired more easily, and sometimes her fingers trembled. Still, she refused to stop playing. "As long as I can move my hands," she said, "I will let them sing." One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, the head of the convent found her sitting quietly at the piano. She was playing a slow, soft melody, something filled with both joy and sadness. The head listened for a while and then asked, "Why do you always play alone?" The old nun looked up and smiled. "Because in the quiet," she said, "I can hear life's music more clearly." The head nodded, though she didn't fully understand. The next morning, a letter arrived, this time from a university in another country. They wanted to honor the elderly nun with an award for her contribution to art and humanity. It was a grand event, they said, with famous musicians and important guests. They invited her to travel and perform one more time in front of the world. The sisters were thrilled, but the nun took the letter and held it gently. "I am honored," she said softly, "but my stage is here. The world already has enough songs. I will play for those who still need to hear one." They didn't try to convince her. They knew that once she made up her mind, nothing could move her. That evening, as the church bells rang and the air turned cool, the same piano that had once been silent now glowed in the golden light. The elderly nun sat before it again, playing softly. Some villagers passing by stopped outside the open windows, listening quietly. The melody drifted into the night like a prayer, calm, full of gratitude and deeply alive. Inside, the younger sisters sat in silence watching her play. None of them spoke, but all of them felt the same thing. They were witnessing something rare, something that could not be taught or explained. It was not about fame or applause or even talent. It was about truth, about a woman who had once been told she was too old, too weak, too forgotten, yet still found a way to remind the world that beauty never fades when it comes from the heart. When she finished, she closed the piano lid gently, smiled at the others and said, "The world makes noise. Let us make music." And with that, she stood up slowly and walked away, her steps light, her spirit glowing quietly like a song that would never end. Weeks passed since the elderly nun's story had spread across the world, and yet the attention around her kept growing. Her quiet performance in that small convent had somehow reached millions of hearts. The video was still being shared, and every day new comments appeared from people saying how deeply they had been touched by her music. What surprised everyone most was that it wasn't just the beauty of her playing that moved people. It was her peace, her simplicity. There was something about the way she sat at that piano, so calm and full of life, that made others feel something they couldn't quite explain. Inside the convent, however, life went on almost the same. The bells still rang at sunrise, prayers still echoed through the chapel, and the sisters still tended the gardens. But now there was a different energy in the air, a kind of gentle pride and happiness. Visitors began to arrive every few days. Some came quietly to attend Mass. Others asked shyly if they could meet the elderly nun. She never turned anyone away. Whenever visitors came, she would sit with them in the small courtyard, talk with them, and sometimes, if they asked, play a short tune. She never chose grand, loud pieces. Her melodies were soft, emotional, and full of love, music that seemed to speak directly to the heart. Children especially loved her. They would sit on the floor near her chair, watching her hands move, trying to copy her finger positions on invisible pianos. Sometimes she would take their tiny hands and place them on the keys, guiding them through a few simple notes. The sound would make them giggle, and she would smile, saying, "Every note has a story. You just have to listen." As the weeks went on, letters from all around the world began to arrive. Some came from people in hospitals who said her music gave them peace. Others came from musicians who said they had found their inspiration again after watching her play. A man wrote from another country saying that he had lost his mother years ago, and seeing her reminded him of her kindness. The sisters helped her read the letters, and sometimes tears would fill her eyes. She couldn't believe her small act, one song played from the heart and could travel so far. "It wasn't me," she would say softly. "It was the music that wanted to be heard again." One morning, a letter arrived from a famous orchestra overseas. They invited her to perform as a guest of honor at a concert dedicated to the power of music and humanity. They even offered to cover all her travel expenses and said the audience would include musicians, students, and thousands of listeners. The younger sisters were thrilled. They imagined her on a grand stage with lights and applause, sharing her gift with the world once again. But when they told her about the invitation, she smiled gently and said, "My home is here. I do not need to travel to be heard." The head of the convent encouraged her to think about it, but she shook her head. "The piano doesn't need a big room to sound beautiful," she said. "It just needs a heart that listens." Still, the story continued to spread. News reporters came to do interviews, artists painted her portrait, and even a filmmaker asked to create a short film about her life. Though she didn't fully understand the fuss, she remained patient and kind to everyone who came. One day, a group of music students from a nearby university arrived. They had been studying her video and wanted to meet her in person. When they entered the chapel and saw her sitting by the piano, they were almost too shy to speak. One of them finally said, "We can't believe how you play with such emotion." "How do you do it?" She smiled, looking at them warmly. "You don't play with your hands," she said. "You play with your heart. The hands only follow." They listened carefully, knowing these were words they would remember forever. After they left, she sat quietly for a long time, thinking about her journey. She had spent so many years believing that her time with music was over, that silence had replaced her song. But now she realized that music had simply waited for her. It had waited until she was ready to play not for herself but for others. That thought made her eyes fill with tears. But they weren't sad tears. They were the kind that come when you realize life still has beautiful surprises left for you. One evening, as the sun was setting, the chapel filled with a soft orange glow. She sat at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. A few of the younger sisters gathered quietly in the back, not wanting to disturb her. They watched as she began to play a melody none of them had heard before, slow, peaceful, full of memory. The sound seemed to tell her story, the years of silence, the pain of being forgotten, and the joy of finding her purpose again. It wasn't just music. It was like she was talking to the piano, thanking it for waiting for her all this time. When she finished, the sisters clapped softly. One of them said, "Sister, the world needs to hear this. You should record it." She shook her head gently. "If it is meant to be heard, it will be heard," she said. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A local radio station reached out and asked permission to play her charity night performance. The convent agreed. Within hours of it being broadcast, messages flooded in. People were calling from everywhere, saying how deeply the music had moved them. Some even said they pulled their cars over on the road just to listen in silence. Soon other stations began to play it too. Her music became a symbol of peace, a reminder of how powerful a simple melody could be when played with love. A few weeks later, a group of journalists visited again, wanting to know more about her life before she joined the convent. She didn't talk much about those years, but that day, she decided to share a little. She told them that in her youth she had studied at a music academy and performed in small concerts. She had dreams just like any young musician. But then life took an unexpected turn. A close friend had fallen ill and she gave up her dream to care for her. Later, she devoted herself to helping children and eventually, her path led her to faith. "I didn't stop playing because I lost interest," she said softly. "I stopped because love asked me to be quiet for a while." Her words spread across newspapers and television screens. People admired her even more. She wasn't just a talented pianist. She was a living example of humility, patience, and devotion. One day, the convent received a visit from a group of orphaned children who had seen her story. They brought her small gifts, drawings, paper flowers, and a handwritten note that said, "Thank you for showing us that kindness never gets old." She hugged each child and told them, "Remember, every act of kindness is a song too. You don't always need a piano to play it." From that day, she decided to dedicate her time to teaching children from poor families. The convent began hosting small music sessions every weekend, and she would teach them not only how to play but how to feel. Don't rush, she would tell them. Close your eyes. Listen to what your heart says before you touch the keys. The children loved her lessons. They didn't just learn about notes and chords, they learned patience, focus, and love. Parents who came to pick up their children often stood by the doorway, quietly wiping tears as they watched her teach. Her influence began to spread even further. People started calling her lessons the music of mercy. Soon, donations began arriving to support the children's learning. The convent used the money to buy more instruments, small violins, flutes, and a second piano. Every Sunday, the sound of music filled the halls. What had once been a quiet convent had now become a place where faith and music blended perfectly. One evening, after a long day of teaching, she sat alone in the chapel again. The candles flickered softly, and she placed her hands gently on the piano. The tune she played was different this time, slower, softer, almost like a lullaby. Outside, people walking by stopped to listen through the open windows. The music floated out into the night air, touching every ear, every heart that heard it. And though she didn't know it, someone passing by recorded that moment on their phone. The next morning, that short clip was shared online. It showed her sitting in the candlelight, her hands glowing faintly on the keys, playing a melody that felt like a prayer. That video spread even faster than the first one. People called it the Song of Peace. Some said it helped them sleep, others said it made them cry. But everyone agreed on one thing. It reminded them of something pure that the world often forgets. She never asked for any of it. She never wanted fame. All she ever wanted was to share a feeling, and in doing so, she ended up touching the world more deeply than she ever imagined. And though the world called her a miracle, she continued to believe she was just a simple woman who listened when her heart asked her to play. After months of quiet teaching and sharing music with the children, the elderly nun began to notice something different about the people who came to the convent. They weren't just curious about her playing anymore. They wanted to know about her life, her choices, and the journey that had led her to this peaceful place. It was as if her music had opened a door, and now everyone was eager to walk through it and understand the woman behind the melody. One rainy afternoon, a young journalist arrived at the convent. He had traveled many miles to meet her, carrying a notebook and a small recorder. Unlike others, he didn't ask to film her or broadcast her story immediately. He simply wanted to listen. The nun welcomed him with a quiet smile and invited him to sit in the chapel while she played a few tunes. She started with a melody that was familiar to everyone who had seen her performance online. Then, as the rain tapped softly against the windows, she shifted to a slower, more reflective tune, one that seemed to carry years of memory, love, and sacrifice. The journalist sat quietly, his eyes filling with tears as the music washed over him. When she finished, she closed the piano lid and looked at him gently. "Do you want to hear the story?" she asked softly. He nodded eagerly, and so she began. She told him about her childhood, about a small house filled with music, laughter, and learning. Her first piano had been an old, worn instrument, but it had taught her everything she knew. She remembered the first time she played a melody that made her parents cry, not because it was perfect, but because it was beautiful, raw, and full of feeling. She told him about her early years as a musician, performing in small concerts and teaching children in her town. She had been known for her skill and her ability to bring emotion to every note. Music had always been her language, the way she expressed what words could never reach. But then life had taken unexpected turns. She spoke of a close friend who had fallen seriously ill. Without hesitation, she had given up her music career to care for her friend. She stayed by that friend's side for years, singing softly at night, helping her through treatments and comforting her with her presence. Her own dreams were put aside, but she never regretted it. She said that love had its own music, and she had answered it faithfully. Afterward, she had devoted herself to helping children from poor families and teaching them in small schools. Later, she had found her calling in faith, joining the convent to serve a life of quiet devotion. She said she had thought the piano had been left behind in another lifetime, that her music had been silenced by responsibility and time. But music never really leaves you, she said softly. It waits until it is needed again. The journalist listened in awe. He had expected a story of talent, But what he heard was a story of sacrifice, humility, and love. Every choice she had made, every silent year, had not been a loss but a preparation. The music had only waited for the right moment to return. When he asked her why she had agreed to play at the charity event, she looked out the window at the rain falling on the courtyard. "I didn't think of it as performing," she said. "I just thought someone needed to hear a song. That's all. I never imagined it would reach so far." The journalist wrote quickly, knowing that these words were rare and precious. He understood that the music itself was powerful, but the life behind it made it extraordinary. Soon, this interview was shared with a wider audience. People were captivated by her story, not just because she could play, but because of the life she had led. They realized that her music was not just talent. It was experience, empathy, and heart. The world began to understand why her music felt so alive. Around the convent, life continued peacefully. Children came to learn, villagers stopped by to listen, and visitors from distant cities came to feel the calmness that seemed to surround her. Yet despite the attention and growing admiration, she remained humble. One day a young woman came to the convent. She had been struggling to find purpose in her life and had seen the nun's story online. The woman said she had felt lost and empty, but found hope when she watched her play. The nun listened quietly, then placed her hands gently on the piano keys and played a few notes. "These are just the beginning," she said softly. "You can find your melody too. It may not be a piano or a song or even music, but if you listen, you will hear it inside yourself." The young woman left with tears in her eyes and a heart that felt lighter. The nun's impact, she realized, was far greater than music alone. It was hope. Soon, the convent became a place where people came to find inspiration. Teachers, artists, musicians, and ordinary families. They all wanted to learn not just about music, but about life, patience, and devotion. Each person who visited left with more than melodies. They left with understanding, kindness, and courage to follow their own paths. The elderly nun continued teaching the children, emphasizing emotion over technique. She would tell them, "Notes are letters. Music is a story. Always tell the story." She encouraged them to practice daily, but more importantly, to listen to the world around them, to the emotions that words could not capture. Visitors often asked how she managed to stay so patient and calm despite the attention. She simply smiled and said, "Peace comes when you do not live for applause. You do what you can with the love you have." Her daily routine remained much the same. She would wake early, pray, and then help with breakfast. Afterward, she would tend the gardens, play quietly, and teach the children. Even when reporters or musicians came, she treated them the same way she treated everyone, with kindness, respect, and a gentle smile. The story of her life inspired others to make changes in their own lives. People wrote to the convent saying they had decided to return to old hobbies, to care for family members, or to dedicate more time to helping others. Many said that her story reminded them that life was not just about achievements, but about love and service. One morning, as the sun rose and the mist hovered over the convent garden, a young boy asked her, "Sister, do you ever wish you had done something differently?" She looked at him with soft eyes. "Every choice I made led me here," she said. "Even the quiet years, even the moments when I thought my music was gone. Every step taught me something. Nothing is wasted if your heart is true." The boy nodded, understanding in a way only children sometimes do. Months went by, and her reputation continued to grow. Musicians wrote to ask for advice. Students wrote to ask for lessons. Families wrote to share stories of how her music had touched them, yet she never sought recognition. She played not for fame or acknowledgement, but because music was her way of giving. Every note she played, every melody she shared was an offering of love. Her lessons with the children expanded. She began including other forms of music, simple songs, gentle rhythms, and small compositions she had written herself over the years. The children learned more than music. They learned compassion, patience, and the importance of listening. One evening, a small concert was organized at the convent for the children to showcase what they had learned. The elderly nun sat in the back, smiling quietly as each child played their piece. Some were nervous, some faltered, but she encouraged them all, gently clapping and whispering words of support. When the youngest child finished, she walked over and played a small melody together with him. The sound was not perfect, but it was filled with life, and everyone felt its beauty. That night, after the children had gone home, she sat at the piano alone, reflecting on her journey. She thought of the years she had spent in silence, the choices she had made, and the lives she had touched through her music. She realized that her story was no longer just about her, but about the people she had inspired, young and old, near and far. She played a soft, slow melody that seemed to carry every memory, every lesson, and every hope she had nurtured over the years. It was music that told her story without words, a story of love, sacrifice, and the quiet power of a life lived with purpose. When she finished, she looked up at the ceiling and whispered a small prayer. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for letting me play again. Thank you for letting me help others find their music too." The world outside the convent continued to watch and listen. Her story, once a small video online, had grown into something much bigger, but she remained the same, a humble, elderly nun who loved her piano, loved her students, and loved the simple joy of giving. And though people called her miraculous, she would always say the same thing. The miracle was not in her hands or in her fame or in the notes she played. The miracle was in every heart that heard the music, every soul that felt it, and every person who remembered that even in silence, life can still sing. The elderly nun continued her quiet life in the convent, but now the convent itself had changed. It was no longer just a place of prayer and routine. It had become a home for music, learning, and hope. People came from far and wide to witness the magic she created, but more importantly, they came to learn from her heart. Even as she grew older, she remained devoted to her students, her music, and her community. Her hands were no longer as strong as they had been in her youth, and some days her fingers trembled. Yet every time she sat at the piano, something remarkable happened. The sound she produced was full of depth, emotion, and life, music that seemed to carry the wisdom of decades. The children she taught had grown too. Some of them went on to play in school bands. Others started teaching music themselves, but all of them carried a piece of her spirit with them. Every note they played reminded them of her lessons, patience, love, and the importance of sharing what you have with the world. One morning, a group of visitors arrived from a city many miles away. They had heard about the nun's life story and her impact on the community. Among them were musicians, teachers, and families who wanted to see for themselves the woman who had inspired so many. She welcomed them warmly, as she did with everyone. She sat at the piano and began to play a simple melody. It was not meant to impress. It was meant to connect. The music carried through the room, soft and gentle, yet powerful enough to silence everyone present. People felt every note as if it were a message just for them, and some could not hold back tears. After the performance, she spoke quietly to the group. "Music is not about fame," she said. "It is about listening, sharing, and caring. When you play from your heart, you touch lives in ways words cannot." The visitors left with a new understanding. They shared her story widely, spreading not just her music but her philosophy of life. And slowly, people in other towns, other countries, began to embrace the lessons she taught. Lessons about humility, kindness, and the simple power of sharing what you love. Over time, the convent received letters, calls, and emails from people she had never met. Some wrote to thank her for inspiring them to pursue dreams they had given up on. Others shared stories of finding peace after hearing her music online. One letter came from a young woman who had been struggling with loss and fear. She said that the nun's performance helped her believe that life could still hold beauty and hope. The elderly nun read each letter carefully, sometimes laughing softly at the memories they evoked, sometimes weeping quietly at the gratitude and stories they carried. She never boasted about her own role in these stories. To her, the music was the gift, and she was merely the messenger. One day, a philanthropist visited the convent and proposed creating a foundation in her name. The foundation's purpose would be to provide musical instruments and lessons to children who could not afford them. She listened patiently, her eyes kind and thoughtful. After a long pause, she agreed, but only on her terms. "This foundation should teach more than music," she said softly. "It should teach patience, kindness, and love. Music is not only notes. It is a way to help hearts grow." The foundation was established, and soon children from all over the region were able to learn to play instruments they had only dreamed of touching. Violins, flutes, drums, and even pianos were donated, and each lesson carried the same spirit that the elderly nun had always encouraged: to play with emotion, to share with others, and to cherish every moment. As her health slowly declined, the sisters and children took care of her. They would bring her warm tea, help her walk through the garden, and sit with her during quiet moments. Despite her frailty, her spirit remained unbroken. She continued to play, teach, and inspire until her final days. One quiet evening, she sat by the window listening to the birds as they chirped softly. She played a melody that felt like a farewell, a song full of love and peace. The children and sisters gathered nearby, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Her fingers moved slowly over the keys, each note deliberate and full of meaning. When the final note lingered in the air and faded, she looked up at the faces around her and smiled gently. "Remember," she said softly, "every melody you play, every act of kindness carries a story. Make it a good one." Not long after that night, she passed away peacefully in her sleep. The convent was filled with sorrow, yet it was also filled with gratitude for the life she had shared. People who had heard her story or seen her play came from near and far to pay their respects. Her funeral was simple, in keeping with her life, but thousands sent letters, flowers, and notes of remembrance. Her influence did not end with her passing. The foundation she had inspired continued to grow. Children who had been taught by her now became teachers themselves. Musicians shared the philosophy she had taught, that music was not only about skill but about love, patience, and connection. The small convent, once quiet and almost forgotten, became a symbol of hope. Visitors who came for her story found something more, a lesson in humility, a sense of calm, and a reminder that it was never too late to make a difference. Her video performances, both from her early charity event and from her later teaching sessions, continued to circulate online. Millions watched, learning not only the beauty of her music but also the beauty of her heart. People described her playing as healing, inspiring, and life-changing. Even years after her passing, children at the foundation still spoke of her as if she were there with them. They remembered her gentle hands guiding theirs, her soft voice encouraging them, and her words about playing with the heart. Teachers told stories of her to new students, ensuring that the lessons she had lived by continued to shape lives. The elderly nun's life became a reminder that greatness is not always measured by fame or achievement. It is measured by the lives you touch, the love you give, and the kindness you share. She had started as a simple woman with a quiet passion for music, but through patience, humility, and devotion, she left a legacy that inspired countless hearts. And perhaps most importantly, her story reminded the world that it is never too late to follow your heart. Even when the years seem long and the chances seem gone, life has a way of giving back what has been held quietly inside. The music she played, the lessons she taught, and the lives she touched all carried the same truth, that love, compassion, and dedication are timeless, and their impact lasts far beyond a single lifetime. Long after she was gone, the convent continued to echo with music. The piano she had cherished remained in the chapel, its keys worn but alive, waiting for new hands to play. Visitors would often pause before it, sensing the stories it held. And when someone played a melody, the spirit of the elderly nun seemed to return with it, reminding everyone that music, like love, can never truly be silenced. Her story became part of the hearts of those who had been lucky enough to know her, and even those who only heard her music from afar felt its touch. She had turned a quiet life into a legacy of hope, proving that even small actions, when filled with love and purpose, can echo through the world forever. In the end, the elderly nun's life was not defined by awards, recognition, or headlines. It was defined by the countless lives she had touched, the children she had inspired, and the music she had shared, music that carried the truth of a life lived with love. And in every note that floated from the chapel's piano, in every melody taught at the foundation, in every heart moved by her story, her spirit lived on. It was a gentle, enduring legacy, one that reminded everyone who heard it that kindness, humility, and love are the true music of life.